Thalia Morgan, 32, stood frozen in her parents' kitchen as the words fell from her mother's mouth like stones. Your brother has always been successful and responsible, unlike you. 20 years of resentment crystallized in that moment. What they didn't know was that their precious son had been embezzling from their retirement fund for years, and I had proof. Nothing would ever be the same after tonight's family dinner. Before I dive into how my entire family was shattered by one explosive revelation, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, hit that like button if you've ever been compared to a sibling, and subscribe to join our storytelling family. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this family revenge drama unfolds. Growing up in the affluent suburbs of Boston, I always lived in my brother Mason's shadow. 3 years, my senior Mason had the perfect resume valedictorian Ivy League education and a 6-figure job at a prestigious financial firm by 25. My parents, Richard and Eleanor Morgan, both successful attorneys, never missed an opportunity to showcase their pride in their firstborn. Mason just closed another major account my father would announce at dinner parties, beaming with pride. He's on track to make partner before 35. Meanwhile, my creative pursuits and journalism degree were dismissed as hobbies and phases. When I landed my job at the Boston Herald, my mother simply asked, "Is there room for advancement there?" The disappointment in her voice was palpable when I explained my passion for investigative journalism. Thalia journalism is a dying field, my father would say, with a dismissive wave. You're living in a fantasy world while your brother is building a future. The family dynamic was painfully predictable. During holidays, Mason would hold court in the living room, discussing investments and property values, while my parents hung on his every word. I'd be relegated to kitchen duty with aunts who would inevitably ask when I was going to find a real career or settle down like Mason did. His marriage to Caroline, a surgeon from a well-connected family, had been the social event of the year. My on-again, off-again relationship with Sam, a graphic designer, was barely acknowledged. Every achievement of mine came with the qualifier. "That's nice, but did you hear Mason just bought a vacation home in the Hamptons?" My promotions were footnotes. His were headline news. When I won a regional journalism award for exposing corruption in the city council, my parents attended the ceremony but spent most of the evening talking about Mason's recent television appearance as a financial expert. The message was clear. Mason was the return on their parental investment. I was the underperforming stock they were stuck with. Our childhood photos told the story. Mason in his debate team victories, Mason at Harvard graduation, Mason at his corner office. I existed in the periphery, the slightly out-of-focus figure beside the golden child. Even our inheritance was unequal. I accidentally discovered that Mason was set to receive 70% of their estate because he would manage it responsibly. The inequality extended to financial support. Mason received help with his first apartment, his wedding, and the down payment on his house. When I needed help after a layoff, my father suggested I budget better and offered a loan with interest, while in the same breath mentioning the new car they'd gifted Mason for his promotion. At 32, I had learned to lower my expectations. Family gatherings became exercises in nodding and smiling through thinly veiled criticism. I maintained a relationship with my parents out of obligation rather than connection. They weren't bad people, just blinded by their favoritism and traditionalism. Success to them meant money, status, and social standing, all things Mason represented perfectly. What they didn't know was that beneath Mason's polished exterior lay a complicated truth that I had begun to uncover. Their golden child was not who they thought he was. And as much as I had accepted my role as the family disappointment, I never expected to discover what was lurking behind my brother's perfect facade. It started with a forgotten laptop. Mason had visited our parents' house for Sunday dinner and left in a hurry when Caroline called about their son's fever. In the chaos of their departure, his computer remained on the guest room desk. I noticed it while helping Mom clean up the screen dimly lit in sleep mode. I should have closed it. Should have texted him about forgetting it. Instead, when the screen came to life with a tap revealing an open email, my journalistic instincts took over. The subject line read, "Transfer confirmation, account #7732. The email detailed a $50,000 transfer from R&E Holdings to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. R&E, Richard and Eleanor. My parents' initials. My breath caught. This could be legitimate. Mason managed some of my parents' investments. But why an offshore account? Why was the email from a generic address rather than his firm's domain? I shouldn't have continued looking. But years of being told I was irresponsible while Mason could do no wrong propelled me forward. I found dozens of similar emails. Regular transfers, all from my parents' retirement accounts to various offshore destinations. The total, nearly $1.2 million over 3 years. My hands trembled as I navigated through his files. In a folder labeled Management Fees, I found spreadsheets tracking the transfers alongside notes about maintaining minimum balances to avoid triggering alerts. Another document contained login credentials for various financial portals, including my parents' accounts. Most damning was an email exchange with someone named Victor discussing creative accounting and guaranteed returns on investments that sounded suspiciously like a Ponzi scheme. Mason had written, "The beauty is, they trust me completely. They never check the statements I prepare for them." My stomach lurched. The golden child was stealing from our parents, systematically draining their retirement savings while being praised for his financial acumen. The irony was almost too much to bear. I downloaded key files onto a USB drive with shaking hands, then carefully returned the laptop to its exact position. As I drove home that night, my mind raced with conflicting emotions. Shock at what Mason was doing. A twisted satisfaction that the perfect son was deeply flawed. Guilt about that satisfaction. And genuine concern for my parents' financial future. For days I agonized over what to do. Confronting Mason directly seemed dangerous. He had everything to lose. Going to my parents meant shattering their world and facing potential disbelief. Why would they trust the irresponsible daughter over their beloved son? My investigative training took over. I needed more evidence, context, and a complete understanding of what was happening before I made any moves. I called a contact at the Financial Crimes Division of the newspaper and asked hypothetical questions about how such schemes typically worked. I researched the accounts I'd found and confirmed they weren't registered to any legitimate investment firm. I even drove past the office address listed on one document. It was an empty storefront with a for lease sign. Most revealing was when I accidentally mentioned struggling retirement accounts during lunch with Caroline. Her response chilled me. "That's strange. Mason just told his parents their portfolio is performing exceptionally well. He showed them statements with a 12% annual return." During a rare dinner alone with my father, I casually asked about their retirement plans. "Mason has it all handled," he said proudly. "We're actually ahead of our goals." He's such a responsible son, so different from when you were younger, and couldn't even balance your checkbook. The final piece fell into place when I received a call from Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister. "Thalia, dear, do you know anything about this investment opportunity?" Mason offered. "It sounds too good to be true, but your mother insists he's a financial genius." He was expanding his operation, using my parents' trust to rope in their friends and family. By the end of my investigation, I had irrefutable proof statements, transfers, emails, and even recorded conversations where Mason alluded to his scheme. The golden child was nothing more than a common thief, and worse, he was stealing from the very people who had placed him on a pedestal at my expense for decades. The next family dinner was in 3 days. I had a decision to make. 3 days to prepare for a confrontation that would implode my family. I meticulously organized the evidence, creating a timeline of Mason's theft and a folder documenting each fraudulent transaction. I consulted privately with a financial crimes attorney who confirmed my suspicions this wasn't just unethical behavior, it was criminal. "Your brother could face significant jail time," the attorney said gravely. "Wire fraud, elder financial abuse, securities fraud. The list is substantial." The revelation hit me harder than expected. Despite everything, Mason was still my brother. The boy who had taught me to ride a bike before he became the golden child. The teenager who had defended me against bullies before he became obsessed with status. Was I ready to send him to prison? I considered an anonymous tip to the SEC or FBI washing my hands of the situation. But that wouldn't protect my parents' retirement or prepare them for the public humiliation when their son made headlines for all the wrong reasons. I drafted and discarded a dozen approaches. A private confrontation with Mason might give him time to cover his tracks or flee. Telling my parents alone risked them warning Mason, or worse, dismissing my claims entirely. A family meeting seemed the only viable option, everyone present, nowhere to hide, all cards on the table. I rehearsed what I would say, anticipating denials, deflections, and counterattacks. Mason would claim I was jealous, vindictive, trying to damage his reputation out of spite. My parents might initially side with him, their default setting for decades. The night before the dinner, Sam called. We had been cautiously rebuilding our relationship after our last breakup, and he immediately sensed something was wrong. "You sound like you're heading into battle, not dinner with your family," he observed. I surprised myself by telling him everything. His reaction was measured, thoughtful. "Are you doing this for justice or revenge?" he asked. "Because those are different roads with different consequences." The question haunted me through a sleepless night. Was I motivated by years of resentment or genuine concern? Both, I admitted to myself. The line between justice and vengeance was blurrier than I wanted to acknowledge. Morning brought clarity. This wasn't just about exposing Mason or validating my worth. My parents' retirement security and potential legal exposure were at stake. The family, friends, and relatives Mason was targeting deserved protection. Whatever my complicated feelings toward my family, I couldn't let this continue. I dressed carefully that evening, professional but understated. No flashy jewelry or bright colors, nothing that could be used to dismiss me as frivolous or attention-seeking. I packed the evidence in a nondescript portfolio and rehearsed key points during the drive. My parents' house looked particularly imposing that evening, a colonial mansion purchased with decades of legal success. Mason's Tesla was already in the driveway alongside Caroline's Range Rover. My modest Honda seemed to shrink in their presence, a visual metaphor I was determined to overcome. Inside the scene was painfully familiar. Mason holding court in the living room, regaling our parents with stories of his latest triumph at work. Caroline elegant in designer clothes, my mother hanging on her descriptions of their recent charity gala, the air heavy with expensive perfume and unspoken expectations. "Thalia." My father's greeting was cordial but brief before returning his attention to Mason's explanation of market fluctuations. My mother offered her customary cheek for a kiss. "You look tired, dear." Working too hard at that little newspaper, Mason acknowledged me with a nod, his expression momentarily flickering with what might have been suspicion before resuming his performance. Did he know about the laptop? Had he noticed the accessed files? Dinner progressed with excruciating normalcy. The usual questions about my career answered with the usual mild disappointment, the usual praise for Mason's business acumen. Caroline's subtle comments about my unmarried status. My father's anecdotes about Mason's childhood genius. When my mother brought out dessert, Mason's favorite tiramisu, I knew it was time. My heart hammered against my ribs as I cleared my throat. Before we continue, there's something important we need to discuss. I began, my voice steadier than I felt. It's about the family finances. 4 pairs of eyes turned to me with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. "This really isn't your area, Thalia," my father said dismissively. "Mason handles all that for us." "Yes," I replied, opening the portfolio. "That's precisely what we need to talk about." "What exactly are you implying, Thalia?" My father's voice carried that familiar tone, the one reserved for when I was being difficult. I placed the first document on the table, a statement from my parents' actual retirement account showing systematic withdrawals. Beside it, I placed the doctored statement Mason had provided them, showing a healthy, growing balance. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. Mason has been embezzling from your retirement accounts for years. These are the real statements, not the ones he's been showing you. The room froze. My mother's hand covered her mouth. My father stared at the papers, confusion warring with disbelief. Caroline went pale, her eyes darting to Mason, whose face had hardened into a mask. "This is ridiculous," Mason finally said, his laugh forced and brittle. "Dad, you know how Thalia gets. She's always been jealous of my success. This is a new low even for her." I have emails. I continued calmly, placing more documents on the table. Transfers to offshore accounts. Communications with your partner Victor about the Ponzi scheme you're running. Login records showing access to mom and dad's accounts from your personal devices. My father picked up one of the statements, his attorney's eyes scanning the details. These could be fabricated. Thalia works at a newspaper. She has access to design software. Of course. Even faced with evidence, I was still the untrustworthy one. "Call the bank," I suggested. "Right now. Verify the balance yourselves." A flicker of uncertainty crossed my father's face. He reached for his phone, but Mason intercepted. "Dad, this is insulting." "You're actually going to check because she made these accusations. After everything I've done for you, if there's nothing to hide, there's no harm in checking," I said. My mother, silent until now, looked at Mason with dawning comprehension. "Is this why you insisted we stop receiving paper statements? You said it was for security and environmental reasons." Mason's composure slipped for an instant. It was, "Financial documents in the mail are a major identity theft risk, and the investment opportunity you offered Aunt Patricia last week, I pressed." The one with guaranteed returns that seemed too good to be true. Caroline stood suddenly. "Mason, what is she talking about? You told me your parents' investments were separate from your other clients." The facade was cracking. Mason's confidence gave way to desperation as he turned to our parents. "I borrowed against your accounts for a temporary investment opportunity. It's completely normal in finance. The returns will more than make up for it. You'll see." My father's face darkened. "You borrowed without our knowledge or consent. I was going to tell you after the returns came in. Mason insisted. You'd never have known the difference, and your retirement would have been even more secure." "How much?" my mother whispered. "How much did you take?" I placed the final spreadsheet on the table. At least $1.2 million over 3 years. Possibly more. The color drained from my parents' faces. That sum represented nearly 2/3 of their retirement savings, decades of careful planning and hard work. "You're lying!" Mason shouted, standing so abruptly his chair toppled backward. "This is what you've always wanted, isn't it? To turn them against me, to finally be the favorite." His words hung in the air, a naked admission of the family dynamic we'd never openly acknowledged. Caroline stared at her husband in horror. "Mason, tell me this isn't true." "It's a misunderstanding," he insisted, but his voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Thalia is twisting normal financial maneuvers into something sinister." My father, ever the attorney, had been silently reviewing the documents. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deadly quiet. "These transfers to the Cayman Islands explain those." Mason's explanation grew more convoluted, filled with financial jargon and vague assurances. With each word, his credibility crumbled further. "I trusted you," my father said, his voice breaking. "With everything." Something shifted in Mason's demeanor, panic giving way to cold calculation. "You never would have achieved this level of wealth without my management. The conservative investments you wanted would have left you with half of what you have now. I took necessary risks. By stealing from us." My mother's voice trembled. "By being strategic," Mason snapped. Something Thalia wouldn't understand with her meaningless career and lack of financial sense. Even now, he couldn't resist the comparison, but this time it didn't land as expected. My father looked at me, really looked at me perhaps for the first time in years. "You discovered this, compiled all this evidence?" I nodded. "It's what investigative journalists do. We follow the money, verify sources, build cases." A new respect flickered in his eyes, the kind I'd spent decades craving. The moment shattered as Mason made a grab for the documents. "This stops now. These are confidential financial records that you had no right to access. I finished for him. I've already secured copies with my attorney, and the SEC has received an anonymous tip with substantial documentation." Mason's face contorted with rage. "You self-righteous bitch. You've ruined everything." The slap of my father's hand on the table silenced the room. "That's enough. You stole from us, Mason. From your own parents." The golden child's mask fell completely. What was I supposed to do? The firm was cutting bonuses. The house in the Hamptons, Caroline's shopping habits, private school for the kids, it all costs money. Money I needed to maintain the life you expected me to have. The revelation seemed to physically hit my parents, their shoulders sagging under the weight of their own complicity. They had created this monster with their expectations and favoritism. Caroline gathered her purse with shaking hands. "I knew nothing about this. Nothing." She turned to my parents. "I am so sorry." Then to me, "Thank you for uncovering this before we were all ruined." She walked out without a backward glance at her husband. The family dinner I'd endured hundreds of times had transformed into something unrecognizable. The golden child exposed, the disappointment vindicated, parents faced with decades of misplaced trust and favoritism. As the initial shock subsided, we had decisions to make about legal action, financial recovery, and whether our family could survive this betrayal. But in this moment, as my brother's carefully constructed life imploded before our eyes, I felt no triumph, only the hollow vindication of a truth that had come at an enormous cost. I know the story is getting intense, and there's so much more to tell about what happens next. If you're feeling the family drama as much as I am, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss how this all plays out. Are you on Team Thalia? Drop a comment letting me know what you think should happen to Mason, and I'll be back after this quick break to continue the story. The days following what we now grimly referred to as the dinner unfolded like scenes from a movie I never wanted to star in. Mason left in a storm of threats and accusations, his final words promising that we would regret this witch hunt. Caroline filed for separation within 48 hours, her attorney contacting mine for information on protecting her and their children's assets from the impending financial investigation. My parents aged a decade overnight. My father, the formidable attorney, who had never shown weakness, sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by financial statements, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he painstakingly traced the extent of Mason's betrayal. My mother moved through the house like a ghost, removing family photos featuring Mason from the walls, leaving conspicuous empty spaces that mirrored the holes in our family narrative. "How did we not see this?" she asked me one evening, her voice small and uncertain. Were we really so blind? The question wasn't just about Mason's theft, but about decades of favoritism and misjudgment. How had they missed the moral bankruptcy beneath their golden child's veneer of success? How had they dismissed my character while elevating his legal machinery ground into motion with terrifying efficiency? My parents hired a forensic accountant who uncovered even more extensive fraud than my initial investigation had revealed. Mason hadn't just stolen from my parents. He'd been running a complex scheme involving several family, friends, and clients, using his reputation and my parents' name to lend credibility to fraudulent investments. The SEC investigation expanded, and criminal charges became inevitable. My parents faced an excruciating decision: pursue full legal action against their son or attempt to handle matters privately. "He's still our son," my mother said during a particularly difficult conversation. "He's a criminal who happened to be your son," I replied, immediately regretting the harshness of my words when I saw her flinch. My father, ever the pragmatist, made the final call. "If we don't file charges, his other victims will. Better to be on the right side of this when it becomes public." His voice cracked slightly. "And it will become public." 3 weeks after the dinner, federal agents arrested Mason at the airport with a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country and $250 0-inches bearer bonds in his luggage. The headline in the Boston Globe the next day read, "Prominent financial advisor charged in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme." The article detailed Mason's systematic theft from clients, including his own parents. My journalist colleagues were respectful but thorough in their reporting. I took a leave of absence from the paper, unable to stomach being on either side of the story. The scandal rippled through Boston's social circles like a tidal wave. People my parents had known for decades stopped calling. Country club acquaintances crossed the street to avoid conversations. My mother's bridge group dissolved with mumbled excuses about busy schedules. Through it all, a strange new dynamic emerged between my parents and me. For the first time, they turned to me for guidance, valued my opinion, needed my strength. The irony wasn't lost on any of us. "We should have listened to you years ago," my father admitted one night as we reviewed options for restructuring their diminished retirement funds. "You saw things clearly while we were distracted." "By the son you thought was perfect, I finished for him." He nodded, the admission painful but necessary. "We did you a disservice, Thalia." Many disservices over many years. These tentative steps toward reconciliation were complicated by my own conflicted feelings. Part of me, a part I wasn't proud of, savored their recognition of my worth after decades of dismissal. Another part ached for the parents who were facing not just financial devastation, but the collapse of their most cherished beliefs about their family. Caroline reached out unexpectedly, asking to meet for coffee. She arrived with dark circles under her eyes and a determination I'd never noticed before. "I want you to know I had no idea," she said immediately. "I'm cooperating fully with the investigation. The children's college funds are intact, they were in my name, but the house, our savings." She shook her head. "He told me your parents were gifting us most of those things. I never questioned it." "What will you do now?" I asked. "Start over," she said with surprising resolve. "I've accepted a position at Boston General. Smaller than my practice at Mass General, but it comes with staff housing temporarily." She hesitated. "Your parents have been extraordinarily kind considering. They've made it clear they don't blame me and want to maintain a relationship with their grandchildren." My parents' capacity for forgiveness, at least toward Caroline and their grandchildren, was another revelation. Perhaps this crisis was revealing strengths none of us knew they possessed. Sam proved to be my unexpected anchor during this period. He showed up with takeout on evenings when I couldn't face cooking, listened without judgment as I processed decades of family dynamics, and never once said "I told you so" about Mason, whom he had always regarded with suspicion. "You did the right thing," he reassured me during a moment of doubt. "It wasn't about revenge in the end. It was about protecting your parents and everyone else he was targeting." Was that true? I still questioned my motivations daily. The line between justice and vengeance remained blurry in the rearview mirror. 6 weeks after the dinner, we received word that Mason had accepted a plea deal. The terms were strict, but spared him maximum sentencing, 8 years in federal prison restitution to all victims and a lifetime ban from financial services. My parents and I sat in the courtroom during his sentencing, a united front that would have been unimaginable months earlier. Mason refused to meet our eyes, staring straight ahead as the judge delivered a scathing assessment of his breach of trust against those who had given him everything. When allowed to speak, Mason offered a mechanical apology that rang hollow, focusing more on the financial pressures and systemic issues in the industry than on his own choices. He didn't acknowledge us directly until the very end when he finally looked at our row. "I hope you're satisfied," he said, his voice cold. "The perfect daughter finally wins." The judge reprimanded him immediately, but the words had found their mark. Even now, he couldn't see beyond our childhood rivalry to recognize the genuine harm he had caused. As he was led away in handcuffs, my mother wept silently. My father sat rigid, his jaw clenched against emotion. And I felt nothing but a profound emptiness where satisfaction should have been. There were no winners here, only survivors of a family catastrophe years in the making. Outside, the courthouse reporters clamored for statements. My father, ever the attorney, delivered a brief, dignified comment about justice being served and beginning the process of healing. My mother remained silent, leaning heavily on his arm. When a particularly aggressive reporter thrust a microphone toward me, asking how it felt to bring down the golden child, I surprised myself with my response. "This isn't about winning or losing," I said quietly. "It's about truth. Sometimes the truth costs everything, but living without it costs even more." As cameras flashed around us, my father squeezed my shoulder, a small gesture that conveyed more recognition than decades of forced family dinners ever had. We were 3 people bound by blood and betrayal, standing together not because of family obligation, but because we had chosen to face the aftermath side by side. It wasn't forgiveness exactly that would take much longer. It wasn't even understanding. But it was a beginning. That night alone in my apartment, I finally allowed myself to cry for the brother I had lost, long before his crimes were discovered, for the parents who were facing retirement with diminished resources and shattered illusions, and for the family we might have been if truth had mattered more than appearances. The family I had known was gone forever. What might rise from its ashes remained to be seen. 8 months after Mason's sentencing, I stood in the doorway of my childhood bedroom, now transformed into a home office. My parents had sold the colonial mansion partly out of financial necessity, partly to escape the memories it held. Their new home, a modest townhouse closer to the city, reflected their changed circumstances and priorities. "What do you think?" my mother asked, gesturing to the desk positioned near the window. "Will this work for when you need to write here?" The assumption that I would want space in their home, that they wanted me to have it, still caught me off guard. These small gestures of inclusion continued to feel foreign after decades of being an afterthought. "It's perfect," I said, genuinely touched by the consideration. The financial reconstruction had been brutal but thorough. With the help of the forensic accountant and a new meticulously vetted financial advisor, my parents salvaged what they could. The restitution from Mason's assets covered approximately 40% of their losses. They downsized, aggressively canceled country club memberships, and my father even came out of semi-retirement to consult on select legal cases. "It's not the retirement we planned," my father admitted during one of our weekly dinners, "but there's a certain freedom and simplicity." The psychological reconstruction proved more challenging than the financial one. My parents attended therapy individually and as a couple working through their guilt, grief, and anger. My mother joined a support group for parents of incarcerated children, returning from meetings with red-rimmed eyes but a stronger spine. Most surprisingly, they asked questions about my life. real questions that indicated genuine interest rather than perfunctory politeness. They attended a ceremony where I received an investigative journalism award, sitting in the front row and leading the applause. My father framed the article and hung it in his new home office alongside his own professional accolades. "I wish we had paid attention sooner," my mother said one afternoon as we sorted through old family photos. "We missed so much of who you really are. I wish I had found a way to make you see me," I replied honestly. We were learning a new language with each other, one of cautious honesty and tentative vulnerability. The old pattern of performance and dismissal gradually gave way to something more authentic, if imperfect. My relationship with Sam deepened through the crisis. His steady support and lack of judgment created a safe harbor I hadn't realized I needed. When he proposed 6 months after Mason's sentencing, my parents' genuine delight was yet another measure of how much had changed. "He's a good man," my father said, embracing Sam with unexpected warmth at our engagement dinner. "He sees the real Thalia, something we're just learning to do." Caroline maintained contact, bringing the children for monthly visits with their grandparents. These occasions were initially strained, but gradually evolved into something resembling normal family gatherings. The children, protected from the worst details of their father's crimes, knew only that Daddy did something wrong and has to be away for a while. They adapted with the resilience of youth, especially with the consistent love of their mother, grandparents, and unexpectedly their aunt. My 4-year-old nephew Jackson took to calling me Aunt Tally and demanding stories during each visit. My storytelling skills, once dismissed as frivolous by my parents, now drew their smiles as they watched their grandson hanging on my every word. Mason's absence created a void that could never be filled, but the space he had occupied began to transform. Where there had once been a pedestal holding the golden child, there now stood a more balanced family structure, one built on truth rather than illusion. I visited Mason once 3 months into his sentence. The meeting was as difficult as expected. He vacillated between bitter accusations and manipulative attempts to enlist my help in convincing our parents to support his appeal. "They'll listen to you now," he said, a statement that acknowledged the power shift while simultaneously attempting to use it to his advantage. "I'm not going to help you manipulate them again," I replied. "Neither am I here for an apology you don't mean. I just needed to see that you're okay." "Why?" he asked, genuinely puzzled. "After what I said in court, why would you care? It was a fair question." Why did I care about the brother who had dismissed and demeaned me, who had stolen from our parents, who had never shown me an ounce of the respect he now desperately needed? Because that's what family should do, I finally answered. Not blindly support or excuse, but care enough to see the whole person, flaws, failures, and all. His expression revealed nothing, but he asked about our parents before the visit ended. I told him the truth. They were rebuilding together, stronger in some ways despite their losses. I didn't mention their therapy sessions dedicated to processing their complicated grief about him, or the nights my mother still cried over family albums. I didn't visit again, but I arranged for a subscription to a literary magazine he had surprisingly requested. Small acts of humanity didn't require forgiveness. My professional life took an unexpected turn when I was offered a position heading a new investigative unit focusing on white-collar crime and financial fraud. The irony wasn't lost on me, but the experience with Mason had given me insights and motivation that translated perfectly to the role. "You have a unique perspective," my new editor said. "You understand that financial crimes aren't just about money. They're about trust, relationships, power." I accepted the position, and my first major investigation exposed a scheme similar to Mason's, but on a much larger scale. The resulting series won a national award and led to regulatory changes in the financial industry. My parents attended the award ceremony, my father telling anyone who would listen that investigative journalism is essential to a functioning society, a dramatic reversal of his previous dismissal of my career. When the first anniversary of the dinner approached, my mother suggested a family gathering of a different sort, a small dinner with Caroline and the children, Sam, and a few loyal friends who had stood by them through the scandal. No performance, no pretensi, no comparison. We need new traditions, she said simply. Better ones. As we sat around the table in their new home, the conversation flowing easily between generations, I caught my father watching me with an expression I couldn't quite identify. Later, as we cleared dishes together, another new tradition, he put it into words. "I'm proud of you, Thalia," he said, his voice gruff with emotion, "not just for what you did about Mason, but for who you've always been. We just didn't see it." The words I had waited a lifetime to hear nearly undid me. I managed a nod, swallowing hard against the lump in my throat. "Better late than never," I finally said. He laughed, a genuine sound that had been rare even before the scandal. Yes, much better late than never. As the seasons changed and life settled into new patterns, I sometimes caught myself waiting for the other shoe to drop for my parents to revert to old habits, for the golden child's ghost to reclaim his pedestal. But the reconstruction held, built on a foundation of painful truth rather than comfortable illusion. We were learning, all of us, that real family isn't defined by perfection or achievement, but by truth, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again after everything falls apart. 2 years after the dinner, I stood in the sunlight-filled kitchen of my new home, arranging appetizers for a housewarming party. Sam worked beside me, arranging cheese on a board with artistic precision, the graphic designer's eye evident even in this small task. "Your parents just pulled up," he said, glancing out the window. "Your mom's carrying what looks like another plant." I laughed. "That's her 5th housewarming plant? We're going to need a greenhouse at this rate." The doorbell rang, and I wiped my hands on a towel before going to answer. My parents stood on the porch, my mother indeed clutching a potted orchid, my father holding a gift bag. "Congratulations again," my mother said, embracing me warmly. "It's a beautiful home. Thanks for having us over first before the big party," my father added, handing me the gift bag. We wanted some quiet time to celebrate this milestone. Their genuine pride in my and Sam's achievement, buying our first home together, still felt novel. In the old family dynamic, my accomplishments would have been measured against Mason's and found wanting. Now they were celebrated on their own merits. We settled in the living room with drinks falling into the comfortable rhythm we'd developed over the past 2 years. My mother shared updates about her volunteer work at the community garden, a new passion discovered in retirement. My father described a pro bono case he'd taken for an elderly victim of financial fraud. "Your series on elder financial abuse really opened my eyes," he said, referencing my latest investigative project. "I realized I could use my legal background to help people who don't have the resources to fight back." His career had come full circle in a way, returning to the idealistic roots that had motivated him to become an attorney before wealth and status became his primary measures of success. The conversation eventually turned, as it occasionally still did, to Mason. His case had been a catalyst for change, not just within our family, but in a broader sense. My father had testified before a regulatory committee about the experience of being defrauded by a trusted family member. My mother had started a support group for families affected by white-collar crime. "He's being transferred to a minimum security facility next month," my mother said quietly. "His behavior has been exemplary, according to his counselor." I nodded, unsurprised. Mason had always excelled at working systems to his advantage. The difference now was that we recognized this pattern for what it was. "Caroline mentioned he's been writing to the children regularly," my father added. "Nothing manipulative, just trying to maintain some connection." It was the healthiest approach he could take, given the circumstances. Caroline had divorced him during his first year in prison, but had navigated the situation with remarkable grace, ensuring the children maintained an age-appropriate understanding of their father without either demonizing or excusing. Him. "Will you see him when he's transferred closer to Boston?" Sam asked carefully. "We haven't decided," my father answered honestly. "We're taking it one step at a time." The rebuilding of that relationship, if it happened at all, would be slow and cautious. Trust once shattered so completely could never be fully restored to its original state, but perhaps something new and more authentic could eventually grow in its place. The doorbell rang again, signaling the arrival of other guests. Before going to answer it, I paused to really look at my parents at the lines of experience, etched more deeply on their faces at the simpler clothes that had replaced designer labels, at the more relaxed set of their shoulders. "I'm glad you're here," I said simply. My mother's eyes glistened with tears. "We almost missed it all, Thalia. We almost missed you." As the house filled with friends, colleagues, and extended family, I watched my parents integrate seamlessly into my world, a world they had once dismissed but now engaged with genuine interest. My father, deep in conversation with my editor about journalistic ethics. My mother exchanging gardening tips with Sam's parents. The easy way they introduced themselves as Thalia's parents with evident pride. Caroline arrived with the children, now 7 and 9. Jackson ran to me immediately, proudly presenting a drawing he'd made of our new house. "For your fridge, Aunt Tally." Later, as twilight settled over the gathering, I found myself standing on the back deck with my father, a moment of quiet in the midst of celebration. "I've been thinking about success lately," he said, gazing at the small but beautiful yard where guests mingled. "How narrowly we defined it for so long." And now I prompted, "Now I think success is this." He gestured to encompass not just the house, but the relationships, the healing, the authenticity of our current lives. Building something real, even if it's from the ashes of what came before. It wasn't a perfect resolution. Mason's absence remained a painful reality. The financial damage he'd caused couldn't be completely undone. Trust within our family would always carry the scars of betrayal and decades of misplaced values. But standing there with my father, watching my mother laugh with friends who knew the real me, seeing Sam move through the gathering with quiet confidence, I recognized that we had achieved something remarkable, a family rebuilt on truth rather than illusion. I used to think the worst thing that could happen was failing to meet your expectations. I admitted to my father. Now I realize the worst would have been never breaking free of them. He nodded slowly. And the best thing that happened, despite everything, was finding our way to who we really are, all of us. We rejoined the party, moving through rooms filled with people who knew me, as I truly was not as the disappointing daughter, the lesser sibling, but as Thalia Morgan, investigative journalist, loving partner, loyal friend, and a woman who had found the courage to shatter a destructive family narrative. The story of my family would always include the golden child's fall, the painful reckoning, the difficult reconstruction. But it would also include this, the discovery that genuine connection grows best in the soil of truth, however painful that truth might be. My brother had stolen more than money. He had stolen years of authentic relationship with our parents, years when their love and approval had been conditioned on a performance he could maintain only through deception. In the end, his greatest crime had been against himself, sacrificing his integrity for a role he couldn't sustain. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, my mother hugged me tightly. "I'm sorry we missed so much," she whispered, a refrain that had become both acknowledgement and promise between us. "We're not missing anything now," I assured her. Later that night, after everyone had gone, and Sam and I were cleaning up the last of the party debris, he wrapped his arms around me from behind. Happy? I considered the question seriously. Not just happy, whole. He nodded against my shoulder, understanding what I meant. Wholeness was different from happiness, deeper, more complex, inclusive of both joy and sorrow, triumph and loss. My family had been shattered and rebuilt. The golden child had fallen. The disappointment had found her voice. And the parents who had created this dynamic had found the courage to see clearly at last. It wasn't the ending anyone would have chosen, but it was an ending that contained a new beginning, one based on who we truly were, rather than who we had pretended to be. And in that truth, however difficult its birth had been, we had finally found our way home. I want to thank you all for joining me on this intense journey through my family's transformation. If you've ever dealt with family betrayal or had to rebuild relationships after a major crisis, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. How did you handle the aftermath? What lessons did you learn about family karma or justice? Don't forget to hit that like button if this story resonated with you, and subscribe to my channel for more real-life family stories where justice eventually finds its way. Share this with someone who might be struggling with family dynamics. Sometimes knowing you're not alone can make all the difference. Thank you for being part of my healing journey. Remember, sometimes the hardest truths lead to the most authentic connections. Until next time, take care of yourselves and your real relationships.